Chapter 3, General Requirements of the Home Program. In this section, we're going to be walking through those program-wide rules that apply to the home program and making sure you understand how those will need to be implemented for the home funds that you are utilizing. So a little bit of background about the home program itself. The funding came about as part of the National Affordable Housing Act of 1990, and it created a completely new type of funding that was specifically dedicated to affordable housing. So we had other HUD funds that had been provided, but they were not specifically set aside necessarily for housing. Part of the community development block grant funding had been utilized for housing, but was not something that was a housing-specific requirement. So this is a whole new source of funding. Part of the objectives of the new source of funding was all of the funds were going to be used to provide decent, affordable housing for low-income people. And as we walk through these modules, you'll see that the regulations define what is decent. We'll be talking about the property standards for this. We'll be defining what meets that affordable housing criteria and how we're going to income qualify to determine that we have low-income people that are actually being the beneficiaries of the projects that we're taking on. One of the goals of this new source of funding was also to harness some of the capacity for the nonprofit sector. And so we'll be talking in later modules about this set-aside of funding for community housing development organizations. The requirements also are looking for local governments to match these new federal dollars as part of their commitment to this undertaking on addressing affordable housing needs. And you'll also see that banks and private sector investments are part of the target for leveraging other funds to work with the home funds to try to address local housing needs. So the way the money flows, on an annual basis, the home program, which is a HUD program, will, based on a allocation process, will provide an annual award or allocation to participating jurisdictions. So participating jurisdictions are local communities, could be city, could be a county, also a consortia. This is a group of smaller entities that would not directly qualify for an allocation directly of home funds, but have grouped together, formed a consortia, and are thus able to qualify for a direct award of home funds. And also states are receiving money as a PJ, and generally they're going to be providing the funding to those areas of the state that are not going to receive a direct award. The state does have the flexibility to be able to invest its home funds within those local PJs in conjunction with their use of local funds. But that is up to ADFA as part of their criteria on this. For Arkansas, ADFA is serving as the recipient of the state's funding and acting as the participating jurisdiction on behalf of the state. There's some deadlines in place. Generally, we have a 24-month deadline for ADFA to be able to commit their funds. That has temporarily been set aside by HUD. It has not been removed from the regulations, but simply temporarily is not going to be enforced. So know that ADFA does need to keep those dollars moving, and we may well see that commitment deadline of 24 months coming back into play once again. ADFA does have a requirement currently that all projects need to be completed within 4 years of the time that those projects are committed. Now keep in mind that the written agreement that you may have in place with ADFA is probably going to require a shorter period of time for you to complete that project, but they, under the home regulations themselves, would have 4 years to be able to complete those projects or the funds would essentially go back to HUD. As part of this process, ADFA has put some rules in place to make sure that they're able to keep those funds moving and they're going to be in compliance with the time requirements that they have under their agreement with HUD. So ADFA has adopted some specific requirements. Recipients must disperse 25% of the funds within 90 days and then 75% of your award within 1 year. So it goes back to what we talked about in Chapter 1 about it being important for you as a recipient of ADFA's home funds to be ready to get that program going, to get the project that you're being funded for up and running so that you'll be able to meet this 25% of funds within 90 days or 75% within 1 year. So within your agreement, there'll also be a completion deadline. You've got 18 months for owner-occupied units to be completed, and then up to 24 months or 2 years for rental and tenant-based rental assistance. So you have some time constraints that you need to live within, and part of that is so that ADFA can make sure that they're going to meet the HUD-imposed requirements. So the money is received, or the award is received by ADFA on behalf of the state, and then through their application and award process, those funds would be, under written agreement, would be provided to the program recipients. In turn, those funds are going to be used to benefit low-income owners, buyers, tenants, whether we're doing a home buyer activity, a homeowner rehab, a rental, or our tenant-based rental assistance. In the end, we always are going to have an income-eligible individual that's going to be benefiting from the investment of those funds. This chart helps us kind of think through some of the regulations that apply to the use of that home allocation. So we tend to call this the sheet cake chart, and we kind of think about this is how we're going to divide up those funds. So on the left-hand side of this chart, you'll see that the maximum that can be used for admin and planning costs, and this is for both ADFA itself and for its recipients, is 10%. So if there was $1 million home allocation, 10% of that would be the most that could be used for admin and planning costs. On the right-hand side, you'll see that there is a minimum set aside. So the amount could be larger than this, but at a minimum, 15% of that home allocation must be used in conjunction with a community housing development organization, and we'll talk in a later module about how we define those organizations, how they will be certified. But 15% of the money must be spent in conjunction with a certified CHODO and taking on one of the CHODO set-aside eligible activities. We'll go into more detail in a later section, but understand that that is one of the requirements for ADFA and its use of funding, and that will be part of their decision-making process as they review potential projects to be funded in making sure that they're going to meet that set-aside requirement. Back on the left-hand side, we have a maximum of 5% that can be provided for CHODO operating assistance. Now, that is an optional part of the home regulations. ADFA is not required to provide any CHODO operating assistance, but that is part of the home regulations themselves. And then this middle block in our allocation chart is all of our home eligible activities that are not part of that CHODO set aside. So our 4 eligible activities, homeowner rehab, home buyer, tenant-based rental assistance, and rental are coming out of our green section, which is the balance, essentially, the money from these minimums and maximums. So just keep in mind the information on this chart is pretty important and will relate to some of our future discussions throughout these modules. But key things here, there's a 15% set aside for CHODOs. That's a minimum. there is a maximum of 10% to be used for admin and planning expenses. So as we've mentioned, there are 4 eligible uses of our home funds, our 4 eligible activities. There will be later modules within this training series that will go into the specific details of each of these activities, but if you are looking at a potential project and it does not fit within the definition of these 4 activities, then know that it's not going to be a home eligible undertaking. So who's going to be involved in these projects? Well, ADFA is the recipient of the home funds from HUD. They will be distributing them to partners within the state. And those potential partners would be units of local government that we would call a state recipient, and they would essentially be operating a program on behalf of the state within that local community. For an example, we might have a state recipient who was going to operate a homeowner rehabilitation program, and they would receive a certain amount of funding to be able to operate that. They would locate the individual homeowners and manage that program at the local level, working in conjunction with ADFA as part of this. The state would also be funding directly CHODOs because we recall that there's a 15% set-aside requirement for them. And then also the state would be directly funding developers. Those developers might be for-profit, they might be nonprofit entities. There will be private lenders who would be involved in the project. They would not be generally a direct recipient of the funding, but would be a partner in some of these projects. We mentioned in Chapter 2 that faith-based organizations are eligible to receive home funds, but there was a cautionary note that eligibility for services or eligibility to be able to occupy a home-assisted unit cannot be based on religious affiliation, and recipients cannot be required to participate in some kind of religious activity as part of their condition of occupancy. And we will be working with third-party contractors. So, you know, a contractor that is hired to complete a homeowner rehabilitation, who's going to be constructing that new rental housing that we might be funding. This diagram is just kind of giving us an overview of kind of how the regulations apply. So in this section, we're talking about program-wide rules. So these apply to the overall program, no matter what activity you will be undertaking. We also, within those 4 eligible activities, have 2 activities that are homeowner, and that's our homeowner rehabilitation and also our home buyer program. And the other half, essentially, our other 2 activities are rental related. So they are our rental development or rehab, and then our tenant-based rental assistance. So we have some rules that are specific to homeowner type projects, others that are going to be specific to rental projects. And then each of our 4 eligible activities have some rules that are specific to that individual activity. And we have 4 separate chapters within the manual and 4 separate modules that you'll be completing as part of this training, which will go through those activity-specific rules. We also have a dotted box here, and keeping in mind that in the case that we're doing a development project, whether it's a home buyer project or a rental development project, there are going to be some steps, some actions that will need to be taken as part of that process, and we'll be walking you through those as we move forward throughout this training. Just gives you an overview. We've got some things that are specific to a particular activity, other things that apply across the board for any activity that you're going to be undertaking utilizing home funds. So a couple of things that we need to understand the definition of, and it has an impact on how we handle some of our later actions in this. We need to know how to define a home project. So within that definition, we are looking for sites that are under common ownership, management, and financing. These will be considered to be a single undertaking. So let me give you an example on this. If let's say I am a for-profit developer and I have a 10-acre site, and I'm going to seek home funds to develop new rental units on that site. I might be doing my market study and determining how many units I think that that market can absorb at one time. And I might be coming into ADFA and requesting funding for a project that's going to build out a portion of that site. So maybe I'm going to build 60 units on that project. Some of those will be home assisted, some will be market rate. Once that project has been completed and fully rented up, when I assess that the market is ready to absorb some additional units, I might be coming back to ADFA and asking for additional funds for a new project on that same site and with the same ownership and management. But it's going to be a separate financing because I've come in with two stages that are a separate financing package. They're going to be underwritten, and that funding decision will be made on two separate projects. So those would not be seen as a single undertaking, even though they're on the same site, even though they have common ownership and management, because they had a different financing package. So that hopefully that helps you kind of understand that definition. Under the tenant-based rental assistance program, we would define a project as assisting one or more families under our tenant-based rental assistance program. So the program provides the funding for all of the households that are going to be assisted, and the project would be defined as one or more families within that overall program. So we need to talk a little bit about how we define a home-assisted unit. So let's use my example of the development of the 60 units of new rental housing. So that's a home-assisted project. We put home funds in to make that project viable, be able to make those units affordable. But not every unit in that project is necessarily going to be set as a home-assisted unit. And we'll talk a little bit later about going through a cost allocation process. But essentially, home allows that flexibility to be able to essentially make a determination of how many of those units within the project are going to be designated as receiving those home funds. And so any unit that is designated as having home funds in it or being home assisted is then going to be considered a home unit. That will mean that that unit is then subject to the home requirements, and that's throughout the affordability period. So that would mean things like a restriction on what the affordable rents can be during that affordability period, income restrictions on who can actually occupy that unit, and then property standards that are going to apply. So keep in mind, within that 60-unit project that I'm developing, maybe I have 10, 12, 15 of those units are designated as my home-assisted units. The other units within that project might be market rate. They might be receiving low-income housing tax credits and so have restrictions that are specific to tax credits, but not have home requirements that apply to them. So this allows you to be able to develop projects that will be mixed income, have some market rate units in that property, which gives a good flexibility within markets and helps to sustain some of our projects. So forms of subsidy, how might we assist that project? Well, we can provide our funds through a loan to the project. It might be in the form of a grant. The home regulations themselves do allow for an interest subsidy, essentially paying down the cost of interest for the project, an equity investment, or creating a loan guarantee pool. Generally, the last three options here are generally not going to be seen in our programs, but they are something that is eligible. Generally, everything's going to be a loan or a grant. All of your ADFA awards are going to be for rental and owner-occupied properties are going to be in the form of a repayable or a forgivable loan. So just in case you're not familiar with that process, so a repayable loan means that that loan has to be repaid at some point or another. Now, we may have a project that we essentially defer those payments until a particular point. So maybe during the first 15 years, we're going to defer those payments, but we might be saying that that would have to be paid if that property is sold or transferred. A forgivable loan usually is set up that after a period of time, which oftentimes is going to match that required affordability period, that loan could be forgiven either completely or in part. So those are options within the ADFA programs. For the tenant-based rental assistance program, those allocations will be provided in the form of a grant to that home recipient that's going to be operating that tenant-based rental program. So another set of rules that applies from the home program is there is a minimum and a maximum in place for how much home funds we can put in per unit. So the minimum is $1,000 per unit. Now this applies to everything except for tenant-based rental assistance. When we're dealing with a multifamily project, we're going to be averaging those. So let's say we were doing a rehabilitation of an existing 4-unit rental complex. We might have a unit that was in very good condition and needed very little work, under $1,000. But as long as the average of what's being put in those 4 units is at least $1,000, that would be eligible under the home program. Generally, we're not having a problem meeting that minimum of $1,000 investment being needed. HUD has put in place a maximum per subsidy or per unit subsidy limit, and those are updated on an annual basis. ADFA itself, much like I think pretty much every other participating jurisdiction, has set limits in place for their programs that are less than those HUD maximum limits. So refer to the ADFA application process to know what the maximum per unit is going to be for your project, but know that that is part of the home program regulations, a minimum of $1,000, and also staying in compliance with the HUD published subsidy limits per unit. So let's talk a little bit about what can I pay for? What can I use my home funds for? So eligible costs, and we have quite a bit of flexibility here. This would include all of your hard costs, your construction costs, rehab, but also the soft costs, which might be, you know, I need an engineer, I need an architect, you know, any of those costs that are related to that construction. This would apply for new construction when we're doing rehabilitation of an existing structure, or in the case where we're doing conversion, where we're taking a non-residential unit and creating affordable housing on that. All of the on-site improvements would also be an eligible cost. So if we are putting in streets and sidewalks and doing grading and plantings and some other things, as long as it's on the home project site, that also is something that's going to be eligible under the home program. So let's talk about the acquisition of properties. It is an eligible use of home funds to acquire a property, and that would be either it could be vacant that we're going to build something new, or it might be an existing a property with an existing building on it that we were going to do some kind of rehabilitation. The requirement on this, though, is that if we are paying for acquisition using our home funds, that construction must begin within 12 months. So home does not allow the PJ to fund where we're going to buy some land and later on we're going to figure out how that's actually going to be used. That would not be allowable. So ADFA's requirement is that the ADFA funds are only going to be dispersed after the construction has begun on that project. So that would be an important thing to know when kind of thinking about how those home funds could be used in covering some of those project costs. Dispersed only after the start of construction. Other things that would be eligible in using our funding. We can do demolition, but keep in mind that home is a housing production program, so it would have to be related to we're going to create housing. Maybe we have a site that has some outbuildings that need to be eliminated, or maybe we're going to clear a site and build new structures on it. That would be acceptable. But again, we need to see construction begin on that. We'll talk a little bit under, I think in Chapter 13, about our other federal regulations. We have relocation benefits that are provided under the Uniform Relocation Act, so that anytime we take on a project with federal dollars that causes households to be displaced, there are going to be benefits that are going to be provided to those households, and those benefits would be something that would be an eligible project cost. Let's talk a little bit about project reserves. So, for example, for a rental housing project, and I'm going to have a 15 to 20 year affordability period, over time there are going to be repairs, replacements that need to be made as the useful life of things have been passed. So let's say I have a project and maybe 10 years in, the refrigerators, the water heaters begin to need to be replaced. I want to have a maintenance or replacement reserve. I also would want to have, and it would be generally, you would have an operating reserve in place. So if there was a shortfall in revenue coming in, that you would have some reserves in place to be able to cover your operating costs. Those reserves are going to be something that ADFA is going to be requiring, but home funds cannot be used to pay for capitalizing those funds. So we can't make that a line item and say, let's set aside $100,000 to put into a fund so that we'll have money waiting there when we might need it. That cannot be, that's not an eligible use of home funds. What is eligible is an 18-month rent-up reserve. So in the instance that we have built those 60 units of rental housing and we complete the construction, we close on our permanent financing on the project, we're going to have to begin to pay that mortgage payment. We're going to have insurance costs, and we're going to be paying our management staff to work with qualifying tenants on that. So during that initial rent-up period, we will not have the flow of income coming in that we would have later in the project when we've been either partially or fully rented up. So the home regulations allow ADFA, as part of their underwriting on a project, to look at that project and determine if there are additional funds that need to be held in reserve to ensure that that project will have adequate access to funds as that project is renting up and getting to the point where it's going to be stable based on the income coming in. So the maximum time on that is 18 months. So looking at that time period, ADFA would go through a process and determine what's the shortfall gap within that 18-month period, and that would be the maximum reserve that they'd be able to put in place. That's the only use for home funds to fund reserve. We already mentioned that also our soft costs related to that project are something that are also eligible costs. So now that we've covered the eligible costs, we need to talk a little bit about, okay, so what things can't we pay for? So as I just mentioned, these reserve accounts, that operating and the replacement or maintenance reserves, that's something that we are not able to capitalize or use home funds to establish. Generally, those funds are either going to be established using another source of money, or they would be capitalized over time out of the cash flow that's coming into that project. Some amount of cash flow would be set aside for each of the units so that it would build over time to be there when it's needed. We'll be talking later in our training about the match requirements under the home program. Just know that your home funds cannot be used to match other federal programs. Also, fees for servicing, originating, or covering costs of administration of the home program. So the home program allows, as we mentioned, this up to 10% of that allocation to be used for administrative and planning costs. So that is how ADFA and its recipients are required to cover their costs. The program does not allow the program to charge fees for some of those actions. So for instance, ADFA will be completing underwriting on each of its projects to ensure that it's going to be affordable, to determine the amount of home funding that's going to be provided. They cannot charge a fee to the developer for taking on what is part of their administrative requirements on this. Now, we will talk about there's some exceptions to that, such as charging an application fee, but generally fees to cover the function of administering the home program are not something that's going to be allowable. Home is also not able to partner or invest its money in 1937 Act public housing units. So there are some exceptions where we have Hope 6 or other projects that are not part of the 1937 Act, but generally know that our home funds cannot be combined with public housing. We'll be talking as we get into home buyer rental and rental projects about an affordability period. And so when we have a project that is it's in that affordability period, it is not going to be eligible for any additional home funds to be put into, invested in that project. So part of our care in being very careful about underwriting these projects appropriately, making sure there's an appropriate market, thinking about the sustainability of the materials, is that we need to make sure that that home project is going to be sustainable during that affordability period, because there is not the option generally to go back and say, I need to put some additional funds in to make this work. During the affordability period, that generally is not something that's going to be allowable. Some other things that are not going to be allowable with our home funds: you cannot use your home funds to acquire or essentially reimburse yourself for a property that that entity already owns. So for instance, if I was a local, a small city, let's say, and I had acquired a piece of property that I thought might be strategic, and later I want to do a home project on that, I cannot, as an eligible cost, include the value or cost of that property and seek to be reimbursed for that utilizing home funds. I also cannot use my home funds for project-based rental assistance. Now, we'll be talking in a later module about tenant-based rental assistance, where we're going to assist a particular tenant. That's allowable under home, but we can't use our home funds to essentially set aside money for a specific project to subsidize those units. It is acceptable if you're able to utilize some other source of funding. So for instance, if we were able to get a HUD project-based rental assistance for our home project, that's great. We simply can't use our home funds to be able to fund that. We also can't pay delinquent taxes on behalf of an owner. So at the point that we have, let's say we have a owner-occupied unit that needs rehabilitation, but they are at risk because they have delinquent taxes, you could not use your home funds to make to bring them current on their taxes. So it might be that you would have a local requirement that they had to work out a payment plan to bring themselves current, but you couldn't use your home funds to assist them on that. Let's talk a little bit about property standards. So when we talked about that original mission for the home program, we talked about decent, affordable housing. And so we have a range of types of properties, and then we'll be talking about conditions that are required. So one of the things we cannot do as far as unit types is something that we would consider to be a facility. So if I was in a, let's say, an emergency homeless shelter, a domestic violence shelter, maybe a treatment facility of some kind, any facility, any project where some kind of a care plan or some kind of client assistance that is a required element or term and condition for occupancy would be considered a facility and not housing. We also need to make sure that home dollars are always spent when we invest our home dollars, that we're going to bring that unit up to standards. And we'll talk later about the specific standards that will apply for different projects. But just know that for my project to be completed and to be considered eligible, I have to ensure and inspect that those units are now in a standard condition, whether that means that I'm going to be rehabbing and making improvements to bring that unit into standard condition, or if I'm building something new, I'm going to inspect it and make sure it meets those standards. And our codes and standards that are going to apply, we essentially have a number of them. Depending on whether it's new construction or rehabilitation, we're going to have a different standard that will apply. We'll be talking later as we go through these activities also about some additional standards that apply specifically to manufactured housing, and a little bit on tenant-based rental assistance, where we have a little variety in what's specifically going to apply. But to show that we have an eligible project, we need to show that that unit has been brought up to a standard condition, and you'd have documentation in place to show that that inspection has been completed and the unit did meet those standards. So that's the decent part of our affordable housing. We also, as part of that mission, talked about it benefiting low-income individuals. So 100% of our home dollars are going to be benefiting households or people that have an income below 80% of our area median income. And so we're going to be doing income certification for every household that we're assisting. Now, we will have some lower targets as part of that. When we get into, particularly in our rental sections, we'll be talking about the program and the project rule. The program rule is requiring that 90% of the households at initial occupancy have to be have incomes at or below 60% of area median income. And then our project rule is that 20% of the units in each of our rental projects that have 5 or more units, those are going to be targeted lower. So they have to be for households at 50%. And so know that we have some requirements, all units at 80% and below, but we may have some additional restriction, particularly at initial occupancy, particularly on rental, where we have 5 or more home-assisted units. Also keep in mind that as part of your program design, you may have determined that what you had a need for, particularly in your local housing, was to meet the needs of a specific sector of affordable housing. So maybe you said, I want part of my project to be affordable for households at 30% or below. Whatever that written agreement has held you to, you would also need to make sure that you are going to meet the terms and conditions of that written agreement. So how are we going to decide how that income is going to be counted? So HUD allows 2 different definitions to be used. And by definition, essentially the definition is saying, what things I'm going to count as income, what things I'm going to exclude. Home program allows two options, the Section 8 Part 5, and then the IRS adjusted gross income methodology. This is pretty simple for you in Arkansas, in that ADFA has said across the board that Section 8, the Section 8 Part 5 definition is always going to be used. So if you were asked what income definition, it's going to be Section 8 Part 5. At the bottom of the slide is the link for the HUD website's income calculator. And essentially what this does is allows you an automated process to be able to plug in that information about the household. It will ask you the appropriate questions about, household members and sources of income, and it will make that calculation for you and allow you to print that out. So that's an option for you to be able to use as part of putting together that documentation that will need to be in each file to demonstrate that all of our HUD-assisted units are going to be occupied by an income qualified household. So the basics of this, we're going to be looking at their gross annual income. There are some adjustments that would be made when setting payments on things, but for eligibility, to determine whether they meet the eligibility criteria to benefit from home funds, they have to be at 80% or below, and that's based on gross income. And we are projecting forward. So we're not looking at the last 12 months. We're going to take whatever our current income is and project that forward. So for instance, if I partway through last year got a pay raise, and so my average, let's say my average income for the year was $30,000, but if I use my new hourly rate and calculate that for the next year, I'm going to be at $37,000. We're going to use that latest current income to be able to project forward for the next 12 months. So we're going to make that calculation based on our income definition, and then we're going to compare that to the published low-income limits that are provided by HUD on an annual basis. So as HUD releases the next year's income and rent limits, ADFA will be sending those out. They might be sending you a notice saying that those are published now and available on their website. But annually, those are updated, and with their effective date, you would then be calculating income and comparing it to make a determination, is this household eligible or are they actually over that income that's allowable? So keep in mind, when we're calculating income, we're going to count income for all of our household members, and that includes non-related individuals. So I could have 3 or 4 people that were occupying a unit. Doesn't matter that they are not related. We're going to count all income that's received within that household for each of those household members to determine what that total gross income is for the household. So one of your key actions will be figuring out who actually lives there and being able to document then for each of those household members what are their sources of income, and making sure that we follow our definition to properly calculate that. Really key for determining, should I be assisting this household? Is it going to be an eligible use of my funds? So the home program has put in place that they expect a minimum of 2 months of source documentation to be collected as part of that income verification. And when we talk about source documentation, that means things like pay stubs, documentation of current deposits or benefit letters for things like Social Security, other sources of income. So we need at least 2 months of documentation in place. You may be working with households that have variable income, so sometimes they make more money than other times. In those cases, part of your standards or your procedures might be to say, I need more documentation than just 2 months to get a good feel for what's reasonable to expect over the next 12 months. But we need at least 2 months. And this bullet point here is also really critical. So income verification is considered good or current for 6 months. So if I collect and calculate that income verification, but I am not ready to commit funds to that individual household, I will need to check at the point that I'm going to provide benefits to them how old that income verification would be. So for instance, if I was running a homeowner rehabilitation program and I accepted applications from my local community, and I determined who was income eligible, but then I started the process of inspecting units, looking at that scope of work before I could determine who I actually was going to be able to assist. If that process took longer than 6 months, I would have to re-verify income. I would have to get current income documentation before I could commit funds to them. So it's something you'll have to keep an eye on, depending on what your process is, to make sure that you have current income verification. When we talk later about our rental projects, know that all of our rental projects, both rental and tenant-based rental assistance, we're going to be annually recertifying the income of each of our assisted households. So the rule would be that at initial occupancy, so when I apply to move into a home-assisted unit, I'm going to do full income documentation, and also on the 6th year of that affordability period for the project, I'm going to do full income documentation. In the other years, I'm not necessarily required to do a full certification. You have a little bit more flexibility. So I could do the full normal certification, but I also could get a self-declaration form from a household, or if I had a household that was found eligible by another federal program, so we knew by definition they were going to be eligible for the home program, we could also accept that. But that's a little flexibility that ADFA has been provided under the home regulations. For tenant-based rental assistance, we are annually going to use source documentation because as part of that, we're going to be determining the level of assistance that we're going to be providing them. So we need to be very accurate on that determination. Let's talk a little bit about affordability period. And essentially, as part of the home regulations, in an effort to make sure that there was a good, essentially a return for the investment on our projects, an affordability period is going to apply for any of our development activities. So our home buyer activities and our rental activities are going to have a requirement for an affordability period. That means that our tenant-based rental assistance and our homeowner assisted rehabilitation do not have a HUD-mandated affordability period. And so based on the investment of home dollars in that unit is going to determine how long that affordability period is. So essentially, the more money I've invested, the longer of an affordability period I want to see to make sure that I've gotten a good return for my investment in that project. That applies whether it's a loan or a grant. We're always going to have a period of affordability, and that period of affordability also determines that period of compliance, meaning that during that, let's say 20 years of affordability, I need to make sure that that project maintains compliance, that I have income eligible tenants, that they are being charged an affordable rent. So I'm going to be looking at rent and utilities on my projects. I'm going to be inspecting to make sure that I still continue to meet those property standards and that I have appropriate leases in place. So however long that period of affordability is set will be the length of time that you as the owner or state recipient are going to be responsible. It's also the period of time that ADFA is going to be monitoring that project and requiring reporting from you. So here's a chart that helps you through this process. So if the amount of assistance per unit is less than $15,000, then there's a 5-year minimum affordability period that will be put in place. At $15,000 to $40,000 per unit, it's going to be 10 years. Anytime that we go over $40,000 per unit in home assistance, there will be an automatic 15 years. If any assistance is being provided as part of a rental housing project to refinance, then it is an automatic 15-year affordability period. And then for new construction for rental, we have a 20-year affordability period. So notice on this that for home buyer program, we might be newly constructing units. We do not have a HUD mandated 20-year. It's only for rental new construction that triggers that longer affordability period. So we will be talking in a later module about the other federal regulations and going into more detail, but just keep in mind that as you're administering the home funds, you're also triggering sort of a list of other federal requirements. So under our fair housing, equal opportunity requirements, we would have to be running our program and disseminating information through a non-discriminatory manner. We're also making sure that we're going to be in compliance with handicap accessibility requirements. So we have 504 requirements for new construction and substantial rehabilitation. Under the ADFA rehabilitation standards, you also have some visibility or universal design requirements as part of that. We talked in Module 2 or Chapter 2 about the OMB circulars, the 2 CFR Part 200, which talk about eligible costs and procurement and audit requirements. That also applies. These are other federal requirements that apply. We'll be having a chapter specifically about our environmental review and the NEPA requirements that will apply. Lead paint, if we have a property that has lead paint that was constructed prior to 1978, we'll have to be in compliance with those regulations. As I mentioned, acquisition and relocation are covered under the Uniform Relocation Act. We'll also be going into further detail along with labor standards, and we have some standards about excluded parties. These are essentially contractors that have been debarred or suspended from eligibility to receive contracts, including federal dollars. So we have a list of other federal requirements that as we follow the home and the ADFA rules, we're also going to be following and making sure we have systems in place to show compliance with this list of other federal regulations. I mentioned before that as far as our designation of our home assisted units, that we're going to use essentially a system of cost allocation. This is something that's going to be completed by ADFA, but essentially the home program requires that if we have a project that is less than 100% home funded, that they go through a cost allocation process to determine how many of those units should be home assisted. Kind of think in terms of, this is a issue of, for our investment, we want to make sure that we get a fair share return on this. Sort of like if you went out to dinner with a group of people and trying to figure out, what portion of the appetizers should you be paying for. For our home investment, we want to make sure that we get, at a minimum, an appropriate or fair number of those units that are going to serve as long-term affordable housing. So part of our cost allocation process will make a determination not only of how many home-assisted units there will be, but also sizing the level of investment. So home, as part of their underwriting and their cost allocation process, will determine what that gap is in need to make that project not only affordable, but also sustainable long-term. And that's how the level of home assistance will be determined as part of that. It's not only for homeowner and rental units, but it's when we have a mix of non-home and home units within a project. So as part of that, what we would call a layering review, ADFA will be taking the information that's been collected within the application that you have completed, and they will be completing that review process. So they're going to be analyzing the budget, the development budget for the project, looking to see the sources and uses that have been committed as part of that, looking to see that the certifications are in place for both the government and private assistance that's going to be part of that process. And they'll be looking not only at the funding and the flow of funding for a development process, but for projects such as a rental project that will have operating costs throughout that affordability period. They're going to be reviewing throughout that affordability period to determine what the costs will be that will be incurred by that project and the cash flow that's going to be generated from that project to determine whether that project is going to be sustainable or not. So that layering review, that process of determining what those costs are and what that level of subsidy that's needed is something that ADFA will be completing based on those required documents they're asking you for as part of their application process. So they'll be completing that up front before they commit funds to the project. Keep in mind, so they are completing this process to stay in compliance with the home regulations. If there's any change that occurs in your project, you need to contact ADFA. They will need to approve those changes, but oftentimes they will have to go back through this process of cost allocation and layering review to determine how many home-assisted units. So, for instance, let's say there was a change order that was needed. Let's say it was determined that some additional fire suppression was going to have to be done for this particular project, and there were going to be additional costs incurred. If there are additional home dollars being put in or additional other funds, that means that this cost allocation process will have to be updated, recalculated, and it could be that they would then have to say, okay, instead of 10 home-assisted units, we now will have to require 11 home-assisted units as part of this process, and so your written agreement would have to be updated. So it's important we mention that the written agreements are a living document and need to be amended over time if there are any changes. This is one of those places where you need to be working with ADFA and contacting them if there are changes in cost, in scope, or the financing on your project.